sit down now and just, what we thought we'd do is, yesterday we met to decide how to do the session. And we thought, I'll interview Musa for about 15, 20 minutes, help bring his ideas out, and then he'll interview me or ask me some questions for about 15, 20 minutes. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for you guys to ask us anything you want.
Make it spicy.
Okay. So Musa, you have the most interesting, unusual, and unexpected biography of any professor I've ever known. And this, it seems to me, has clearly been essential for your ability to take so many perspectives and to just reflexively but not annoyingly challenge received wisdom. So can you tell us about your family background and your personal journey through religion, through politics, and through employment? How did you get here?
Sure. I mean, maybe the tweet length version. So I was
okay.
So I was initially on the religious side. My first plan in life was to be a Catholic priest, and then I had this crisis of faith, and I became an atheist for a while. But I struggled with my atheism, and eventually, yada yada yada, eventually became a Muslim. In terms of my family background, I grew up in a military community at Fort Huachuca, which is the main military base for the Army. And initially, when I started higher ed, I started at community college, and I was studying philosophy because it was a way to explore some of the religious questions about the meaning of life and stuff from a secular point of view. But then I had a twin brother. He was killed in Afghanistan. And at that time, and that kind of grappling with that tragedy caused me to kind of rethink the kinds of things I was interested in and rethink the importance of politics and some of these knowledge problems. And so I shifted my focus to epistemology and applied social epistemology with a focus on national security and foreign policy questions to help other families avoid the kind of tragedy that my own family was going through. After I graduated, I was teaching political science at University of Arizona. Then I got canceled by Fox News. And then I lost that job.
What year was that, this cancellation?
That was 2014. Yeah, if you had gone to foxnews.com on 2014, the first thing you would have seen is my face. Bah, radical Muslim professor corrupting the youth. Every institution and center that I was affiliated with got flooded with death threats and hate mail. And at first, the U of A was like, yes, we here at University of Arizona believe in academic freedom, but then they just didn't renew my contract. So it goes. And I think it's a big problem in higher ed, and actually an under-discussed problem, frankly, is that adjunct professors basically have no academic freedom to speak of. They have very little protections. They have very little governance influence. I think a lot of the focus on academic freedom is focused on tenure-track professors on the one hand and students on the other. But the people who do most of the teaching and a lot of research are adjunct professors. And so as I discovered firsthand, academic freedom for adjunct professors and contingent faculty members is a dodgy proposition. And so I was, for a while, I struggled to figure out what to do. I was selling shoes at the mall and in Sierra Vista, in the town I grew up in, and there was a management spot that was open, and they wanted to promote me, but the district manager refused to promote me because he thought I was overqualified and I wouldn't stick around, so I couldn't even be a manager in a shoe store. I applied to PhD programs. I got rejected from all of them the first round. And then I managed to, I'll yada yada this, but I managed to fail upwards to Columbia University eventually, where I pursued my PhD. And then, interesting job market experience, but I ended up at an awesome place at Stony Brook University. I have a great department, great peers. So yeah, that's the nutshell version, I guess.
Okay, but I think that, and you've done some of the work on class diversity, and you've talked about it, class diversity in the professoriate. Getting a PhD and becoming a professor is generally not something that people from working class or even middle class families aspire to. It is usually a fairly elite background nowadays. And so, so I think you can see how his background, his experiences, the fact that he's been all over, have really helped to make him such an original thinker. All right, so some of your best work, I think, on the HXA blog and elsewhere in your writing has been on intellectual history. I've learned a lot of the backstory of what was happening. As a social psychologist, I'm really focused on the social dynamics of what changed in the early 2010s, what changed in 2014, 2015. That's what the Coddling the American Mind was about. But from your writing, I've learned, like, actually, there are cycles, and nothing is entirely new. And if you have a chance, if you go to the HXA blog, I guess these are on your webpage too, but two that really stood out to me: Seizing the Means of Knowledge Production was one essay, and Colossal Failure, colossal like corpus callosum, 100 Years of Viewpoint Diversity Activism. So if you could help us understand, what is the intellectual and historical backstory, way before 2015, way before 2011? What do we need to know about the academy or about cycles of history to understand where we are now, if we are to make it through to a place where universities regain public trust and really return to their mission?
Yeah, so I think there's two important things to bear in mind. I think one of them to bear in mind is that the things that we're trying to do at universities are genuinely hard. So it's human nature when you're confronted with views that strongly go against your priors, that conflict with your own values and your own objectives and things like that. It's human nature actually to hunker down and to kind of align with allies. And so there's a deep sense in which what we're trying to do at universities in general, and at Heterodox Academy in particular, is unnatural. And in part for that reason, there are these kind of perennial tensions, the kind of problems that we're trying to address. Insofar as there are elements of human nature, they're never going to be fully resolved, right? The tension will always be there. The problem space will change. But the underlying tension of how can we have people from different backgrounds with different interests collaborating together to produce shared knowledge, is just going to be a persistent issue that we'll have to think through and work on together. It's something that we'll have to actively sustain. There's no way that we're going to be able to just coast on victory at any point.
What was it like? What was it like 100 years ago? Was it left, right? Like, what was the issue? How did you see these difficulties in the early 20th century?
Sure. Well, okay. So I'll flag one thing that I address in my forthcoming book with Princeton University, available for pre-order now. So one thing that I do talk about in the book is that, and I show so. You can look at a lot of the empirical measures to show that there was a there, that something changed after 2011. You can look at a lot of those same measures, and you can see that actually what happened after 2011 was a case of something. And so what I show in chapter 2 of the book is that if you compare and contrast those cases, you can get a lot of insight into, like, under what circumstances do these awakenings come about? When and why do they end? What, if anything, do they tend to change? How does one affect the next? And so on. And so the first one of these movements was in basically the 1920s, the 1910s, 1920s. That was when you saw some of the battle lines were actually the same, and I think this is underappreciated. So for instance, some of the original movements for Black liberation, for LGBTQ rights, the first wave of feminism, all of this was born around that same time. As Eric Kaufman argues, this asymmetrical multiculturalism, so the idea of basically analyzing non-whites and women in a systematically different way than you analyze whites and men, is actually an analytical trend that started in the 1920s. So a lot of this stuff actually goes back like a century. It's not a new thing. And so that's what I try to show in the book, is that it's important to you can learn a lot often by just expanding the scope of analysis. Yeah.
Okay, so trace it through to us for us. You've got these waves. There, is it that there are waves that are, more progressive and change-oriented, and waves that are more conservative and consolidating?
Yeah.
And then take us up to what did happen in the 2010s. Why did everything go so crazy in the 2010s? And in a sense, this is maybe a preview of parts of your book, but please give it to us.
So I guess the nutshell argument in the book is that when you look at, so a lot of the narratives that people have tried to argue about why things changed after 2010, they don't really hold so well if you understand this to be a cyclical thing that goes back to, again, 100 years at least. So it can't necessarily be social media or unique things about Gen Z in particular, or things like this. that are the core driver. I think a lot of these contextual things change the way these events play out from one cycle to the next, but that can't be the thing driving the cycle. And the thing that I basically, through process of elimination and by other testing, I came up with basically two things that seem to predict when a moment of awakening will happen. The first is that they tend to occur in moments of elite overproduction. So that's when you have a lot more society is producing a lot more people who are highly credentialed, who have big expectations in life, but there's not enough positions within the elite structure to absorb them. And so those people often get turn against the, as their kind of life prospects aren't living up to what they had hoped, they kind of turn against the social order, try to tear it down, try to depose existing elites and kind of install themselves in their stead. So that's one thing. But the second factor is that there's this phenomenon that my advisor at Columbia, Seamus Khan, highlighted called, he flagged that the prospects between elites and normal people often operate countercyclically. So times that are really bad for elites tend to be good for normal people, and people that are good for normal people tend to be kind of bad for elites. And so this creates a problem. So times that are bad for elites, often, it's hard for them to really launch movements or anything like this, because the rest of the public is, most of the rest of the public is doing fine, and they don't really care about the suffering of the poor elites or anything like this. And so the moments when awakenings happen tend to be when you have, when things are bad for, have been kind of bad and growing worse for normal, for kind of average Americans for a while, and then suddenly they're bad for elites too. So when you have that kind of, when these kind of moments when the trajectories get collapsed, those are the moments when awakenings.
So would you say then that the global financial crisis set us up for that?
Yeah, and so one of the things I show in the book is people often talk about things like Occupy as being somehow distinct from the Great Awakening. And in fact, there's even some conspiratorial-ish narratives that argue that corporations cooked up the Great Awakening as a way to distract and derail the class-based solidarity that was the Occupy movement. But what I show is, like, it's been the same people, actually. It's the same narrow slice of society that's, that was saying we are the 99% in the 2010s, and then became part of the resistance, and were advocating for Black Lives Matter and taking part in Me Too, and then became Trust the Science stands in 2018. It's been this one kind of wave of, a continuous wave of activism from the same rather narrow and idiosyncratic band of society.
All right, so that's about 20 minutes. So you see that if you want to understand what is happening in our universities and get both a historical perspective and a sociological perspective, and if you want to understand what's happening politically, why do we have a wave of populism, not just in the US, but all across much of the Western world? Pre-order now. We have never been woke. I just tweeted it. There's a link to Amazon there, but you can find that link yourself.
And that's your copy now.
It's
My great honor to be able to finally present to you with a book.
Okay, thank you. He just got these. He just got the. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, okay, so one of the things that I think is fascinating about your, okay, this won't be fully a love fest, and again, I have, but one of the things that I find is like really fascinating about you is that you've also been on a really interesting journey, intellectually, religiously.
Mm-hmm.
So as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, you were raised in kind of a secular, liberal household, mm-hmm. and then as you started doing your field work for your for the research you were doing in India, you came to realize that to gain a new appreciation for the sacred and for purity and for tradition and religion and things like that, and that kind of helped set you on the path to broadening your horizons. So you want to talk about that a little bit? Your own kind of really interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. So yeah, that's basically true, but there's a lot more to it. So when I was young, I was sort of very stereotypical, grew up Jewish, part of the sort of the great Jewish assimilation, progressive, my parents worshipped FDR. I went to Yale, I was on the left, I ran a gun control group. I was just like totally stereotypical, very judgmental and moralistic, hated conservatives, hated Ronald Reagan. I was just like a total stereotype of a Yale student, basically. And then I went to, through a long process, I ended up going to Penn for grad school. I picked morality, I picked moral psychology as my field. I was looking at it cross-culturally, still hated Republicans, still wanted the Democrats to win. And and I began thinking that I was going to use my work to help the Democrats. But actually, something had happened to me about 10 years earlier. So in 1993 is when I went to India. And that year was really the turning point in my life. And I've only really begun to speak openly about it recently because Michael Pollan's book, what's the name? How to Change Your Mind. That sort of opened up the dialogue about psychedelic drugs. But I thought, as Musa and I were talking yesterday, I thought, I want to tell the story here because it actually is very relevant to the idea of viewpoint diversity. So here I was. I got a postdoc at the University of Chicago. I spent 2 wonderful years in this city, and I got a fellowship to go to India for 3 months to study in Bhubaneswar, India, where my advisor Richard Schwader had done field work. And so here I am. I've always been interested in Hinduism and Buddhism, and I was reading the Bhagavad Gita, and a lot of it is about reality, the veil of Maya. Don't take what appears to be so seriously, and the universe is unfolding as it should, and don't be so judgmental, and be the same in success. So there's a real sort of Eastern philosophy idea that always appealed to me since I was an undergrad. And then on June 11th, 1993, I was back in Philadelphia, and my ex-girlfriend and our gang, she got some acid, and we all did it together. And in that one night, I learned more about Eastern philosophy than in years of study. And it's all in Michael Pollan's book, and it's in a lot of, Sam Harris talks about this brilliantly. But it really felt like, the metaphor that I use is that I had spent all my life living in this fabulous mansion with all these rooms, and I loved exploring the rooms. And then one night, God punched his fist through the roof, picked me up, took me out, took me around the world and showed me everything that was out there. And then he put me back in the house, sealed up the roof, and said, go on. And from that day on, my personality changed. It literally changed. It was much less judgmental. I don't think I had a moment of anger for the next 7 or 8 months. Not a moment. Whereas I would usually I was sort of type A, I'd get irritated easily and impatient. So I became much more willing to just say, there's a vast world of experience, and people are doing the best they can, and it's beyond our ability to really comprehend. And it just really helped me take on a view of not being judgmental. So this is June 11th, and like many people, it feels like a day of rebirth. It's like a religious conversion. So then I go to India in September and spend 3 months there, and it's hierarchical and sex segregated and religious, and there's some cruelty, there's some beauty, but I didn't take the standard American view of, this is terrible and the caste system is, yes, I think the caste system is bad, but I was trying to understand them. I wasn't judgmental at all. And that opened my mind to traditional Indian society, which opened my mind when I got back to America to conservative religious America, which before then I had the usual contempt for, and thought, it's sexist and racist and all that stuff. But once I tried to understand India, I was able to understand conservatives. And that, for me, was the breakthrough that allowed me to write The Righteous Mind, not as a book of polemical, here's how the Democrats can win, which there were so many other books of, but as, wait a second, we all need to understand what's tearing us apart and why people believe different things. So I guess I would say that if not for that LSD trip in Philadelphia, and going to India, if not for those 2 things, I wouldn't be sitting here today, because I would not have written The Righteous Mind, I would not have given the talks on understanding each side, and I would not have founded Heterodox Academy, if not for those 2 things.
So, quote, John Haidt, do drugs, the right ones. No, I'm kidding.
Not too much. You're doing the Michael Pollan thing. Right.
Yeah.
What is it? Eat food, mostly plants, not too much. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, okay, so another thing that I think is really interesting that I think people might not know about you is because oftentimes when you encounter people like you who are really prolific, your new book, The Anxious Generation, is one of the, I had a hard time buying this in the store because they sold out all of the copies. They had to go to the back. And it was like the number 3 book on all of Amazon. Okay, so I think a lot of times when people see someone successful like you who's, they don't necessarily see the struggles and the failures, so they take for granted that you must have been this brilliant person who was always well respected, and you kind of but one thing that I think a lot of people don't maybe know about you is that, as I understand it, you actually had a tough time on the job market. You actually had to go on the market more than once. There were parts where you considered leaving academia altogether. And I think for early career scholars who are kind of navigating a difficult space, I guess 2 questions. One, can you just talk a little bit about your kind of experience navigating the space, and then do you have advice for other early career scholars who are interested in heterodox ideas and are worried about how do you, again, like, how do you navigate the space? What am I going to do? Is there a place for me in the academy?
No, thank you for that question. I did my PhD at Penn. I got this great postdoc. I did what I thought was really good research there. I went on the job market. I applied to 24 jobs. This is 1994. I got one interview at Harvard and didn't get the job. And then I was very bitter. I'm working hard. I'm really good. Why is there no place for me? And my mind was going on to well, maybe I should just quit. Maybe I should just leave. They don't like me. I don't like them. I mean, very immature thinking. But I got a second postdoc back at Penn, working for Judith Rodin, the new president of Penn at the time. And I learned a lot on that postdoc, and I applied a second time. And having recommendations from the president of Penn, who was a social psychologist, really helped me on the job market. And then I was able to get my job at the University of Virginia. But then at UVA, I think I'm a reasonably good experimentalist in a field of great experimentalists. And I think I'm a very good theoretician and scholar in a field of mediocre theoreticians and scholars. And so I had very little empirical publication, and I barely got tenure. I know this because this was back in the old days when everything was on paper, and they returned all my printed copies to me. The secretary had inadvertently left the routing slip from the chair to the dean reporting the vote, so I know the vote was very close. I almost didn't get tenure, and I thought about dropping out some other times as well. So that's the background. Now, every month or so, I'll get a question from a young scholar, given the politics, and I'm heterodox, or I'm writing on gender or race or something, and is there a chance for me? Should I stay in? Now, and I guess what I would say is this: yes, the times, the obstacles you'll face going against the prevailing view are greater today than what I faced. But I'll say 2 things. One is, if you can actually get a tenured job in the academy, even though it's a lot less fun than it used to be, there used to be a lot more humor. I mean, everything's just much more negative nowadays. But it still is an incredible job to be able to be paid to basically just do, think about whatever you want. So, I mean, I'm in a business school, and they actually let me do this long thing on youth mental health, which wasn't related to business, except that actually it is, because a few companies have a business model that is destroying a generation. All right, so the point is, it is extraordinary freedom, and it is actually, for all we complain about it, it is still an amazing life. So I'll say that. Now, the other thing I would say is, the question of whether you should get a PhD, my answer will generally be yes. If you love ideas, in fact, the test I usually do is, okay, you have to make your life using primarily people, things, or ideas. Pick one, quick. And when most people say people, and I say, okay, and I encourage them maybe get a master's degree or something. But if people who say ideas, people who just love to live in a world of ideas, I say, yeah, get a PhD. It's really fun. Often you're getting paid to get it. Yes, your chance of getting a tenure-track job is much lower than when I was on the market. As you're finding out, it's really, really hard. But if you have a PhD and you don't get a job, you have so much more credibility with there's so much else you can do. So if you enjoy the process anyway, do get the degree, and you will be much more valuable. There's so many opportunities in business and think tanks and government. And then the other thing I would say is, when I look around at who has really risen to levels of respect and success, it tends to actually be more the heterodox thinkers. Now, obviously, I'm biased in who I think rose, but my point is that the people who go up the main line, and in social psychology, most people study racism, prejudice, discrimination. There's not a lot left to be found, and they don't really do much. Whereas those of us who picked some place that nobody's looking, it's there's low-hanging fruit just waiting to be picked. So if you come in with a different mindset, it's a gamble. You're rolling the dice, but you have a chance to make much more important discoveries because of that. And if you don't get a job, you have many other options. So I would encourage you to stick with it. And a final reason, we really need you. We really need PhDs, professors coming into the academy who are different from others in their thinking.
I'm going to ask a couple questions about about the anxious generation and the coddling of the American mind. As I see it, in some ways the anxious generation is a continuation of some themes of coddling. So I have two questions, I guess. One is, so for one thing, as you note in coddling, you're thinking of the problem that Heterodox Academy faces, kind of evolved over time. So when you and Greg first wrote the column in The Atlantic, you had thought, well, the problem is that higher ed is kind of teaching people these bad habits of heart and mind, and higher ed is the problem. And then as you started researching for the book, you realized, well, actually, holy crap, the issue is kids are coming to campus with these mindsets already pretty well set into them through the way their parents have been raising them, through their K-12 schools, things like this. So I guess one question is, given that professors and administrators and other academic stakeholders, if we're not the problem, if we're not the main problem, if we're not the main thing driving it, instead we're forced to kind of play on the field that has been kind of served to us by the broader society, I guess what is the advice that you would have for faculty members or administrators on how to kind of navigate and encourage a different set of values and practices and expectations among young people? And a related question, kind of an asterisk, footnote question, is that in the anxious generation, you focus a lot on how tech and the kind of people being addicted from a young age to screens and to social media and things like this kind of erodes our ability to focus, erodes our ability to concentrate, to do deep reading and things like this. In the anxious generation, on the policy side, you focus mostly on people under 18. But for professors, we mostly have people over 18. So I guess one question is, what's your sense of, for instance, the use of computers or technologies, laptops, cell phones in the classroom at the college level, not the K-12 level, for people who are adults, legally? What's your opinion on the kind of the value of the use of these technologies in the classroom?
Okay, so yes, the Coddling the American Mind. It was for me a side project that I did with Greg. Because I had a book contract to write a book on capitalism and morality. I got that in 2014. I still haven't written the book because, like, universities are blowing up, society's melting down. Like, there's more urgent things than fixing capitalism, it seems. So in the coddling, Greg and I, we offered, like, there are 6 chapters on 6 different causes that led to this blow up. And we originally thought that universities were teaching students, that was Greg's initial insight, teaching students to think in cognitively distorted ways. And we discovered that actually everyone born after 1995, I mean the generation, not every single person, the generation has these issues whether they went to college or not. And so we have some speculation as to what led to the rise of anxiety and depression, because that's a big part of this. You have a more anxious generation coming in 2014, 2015. They see words as more threatening than the millennials did just 2 years earlier. So the arrival of very anxious students is one of the 6 threads. And in the chapter where we write about that, we say, now, why is this? Why are they so anxious? And we say, well, the overprotection will make you anxious. But, we have 2 paragraphs on, but, the timing fits. It could also be social media. We don't really know. There's not a lot of evidence, but the timing is right, and there's some correlational studies. So we wrote that in 2017, and we just didn't know. And then the book comes out, and some people challenge me on, there's no evidence about social media. There's no evidence. And so I started organizing all the evidence in Google Docs and
creating an open source thing that incorporated that encouraged a lot of people who disagree with you to participate.
Yeah, that turns out to be just a really great way to work. But to keep, there's so many ways I could go. But to keep it focused on your question about advice to people, to professors and educators. So what I would say is the overprotection is a huge part of it. Because humans are anti-fragile, and we're not treating them that way. And then the sudden transfer of life from a play-based childhood out in the world to a phone-based childhood, which happened very rapidly between 2010 and 2015, is the other piece of it. So in the anxious generation, it's really about those 2 pieces. Now, what are the implications for professors? One is on the anti-fragility side. So I've been doing this since I wrote The Coddling. I teach at NYU. I used to teach just MBA students, but now I'm teaching undergrads as well. As we saw that their mental health crisis is so serious, I am teaching a flourishing course, a positive psychology course. And I have them read chapter 1 of The Coddling, which is the one that lays out anti-fragility, Nassim Taleb's idea that some systems grow stronger when they're challenged and even threatened. So I have them read that, and what I've discovered is so Gen Z is not in denial. They really know that they've been overprotected. They know that the screens are messing them up. And if you offer them the chance to grow, they will take it. And so what I would recommend that you do is have them read chapter 1. We put it available for free on the website, thecoddling.com. If you're dealing with young people, have the group read chapter 1, anti-fragility, and then say, okay, now, I really want you to succeed. That's what I'm here for. I want you to become the best student or employee or whatever it is. There's 2 ways we can do this. One is I can give you very gentle feedback couched with all sorts of stuff, and I'll be very careful about your feelings. The other is that I can give you very critical feedback, and I will point out the things where I think you've made a mistake or could improve. Which do you want? They all take the second, all of them, when you put it that way. So Gen Z is more fragile, but they don't want to be. And our impression of them is often influenced by the extremes that are, acting up and acting in ways that seem illiberal. But the great majority of them, they're good kids who want to learn. That's why they're in college. So that's the first thing.
Yeah, so you think trust, in a sense, have more faith in the Gen Z students, challenge them, but in a kind of constructive, encouraging way, provide them encouragement.
Yes, I wouldn't just say trust and have faith, because that's a good way to get canceled.
Yeah.
But I would say... I would say, if you frame it the right way, they will rise to the opportunity to
What do you
grow.
think about screens in college classrooms?
Okay, so that's, yeah. So I used to always allow, because I have terrible handwriting, I like to take notes on a laptop. I always have something with me. And so for many years, at UVA and then especially at NYU, I would say on the first day of class, we can't multitask, here's the evidence. So, but I want you to be able to, use your devices and stand up and swear. And I'd write out the pledge on the screen. I hereby swear that I will only use my screen, my computer, for class-related purposes. And, if you see that, okay, now sit down. And the TA told me, after, they can't do it.
Yeah.
They cannot do it. She'd be in the back row, and she'd see half the class is shopping, half the class is texting. They cannot do it.
I was shocked by how much students shop in class.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So we're dealing with an extraordinarily addictive kind of technology and an extraordinarily addicted generation that has been on this stuff since the age of 10. And so what I've discovered is what every school discovers that goes phone-free. All around the world, when a school says, you know what, you can't have the greatest distraction device ever invented in your pocket. You have to put it in a yonder pouch or a phone locker. Something magical happens within a week. Within a week, there's more laughter, people are paying attention, they're talking, they're listening to the teacher. It's magical. And I got the same results with my MBA students and my undergrads. My rule is now an absolute no screens of any kind during the class. And sometimes you have to make an accommodation for someone, but and they understand it and they appreciate it, because they say, because look, they're paying a lot of money for business school, and they actually are attending to the professor rather than shopping.
Might as well learn something.
It's like, yeah, they are.
Okay, so I have one more question for time. I want to allow some questions
make
for
sure.
the
We're
audience.
good. Yeah.
So one thing that I think is interesting about your books that I don't think you draw out like super explicitly, but that I think is like present as subtext, and a very pronounced subtext as I'm reading it as a sociologist, there's like this interesting class story. Mm-hmm. So in Coddling of the American Mind, for instance, the kind of unique parenting styles of overprotection, of paving the road, of these highly structured, like all their time is structured and they're closely monitored. Like that's not necessarily a parenting style that's adopted by Americans writ large. It's much more pronounced among highly educated, liberal, urban, kind of professional parents. So there's this kind of interesting class dynamic in that parenting style. And then on the flip side, for the anxious generation, the story you're telling about smartphones. It's actually the opposite slice of society that's left with their devices unsupervised, largely unstructured time for huge blocks of time at a time. And that tends to be relatively less affluent Americans. And so I guess one thing that I'm wondering is, how do you think about class? How do you view class when you're kind of analyzing these social trends?
Yeah, I guess I'm more attracted to theorists who view class more in cultural terms and symbolic terms than in economic terms. I've never had a lot of sympathy with Marxist approaches. In this case, right, so the basic facts are what Musa's referring to is there was a book called Unequal Childhoods, I think it was called, by Annette Leroux. Yeah. And she talked about two different parenting strategies. The sort of the upper third or third or so of the country uses concerted cultivation. You're my little plant, and I'm going to get you. I'm going to bring you to here and here and here and get you these nutrients, and then you're going to get into a top school. And the bottom third, at least, used what she called natural growth parenting. There's a lot of kids around, and you guys go do your thing, and I've got my stuff, and kids they'll grow up. They'll just grow up without me having to make them grow up. So that was true in the 90s. But what often happens is whatever the upper class is doing eventually trickles down to the lower class. And there's some stuff I quote in the book showing that even now, working in the 2010s, a lot of working class families have the same paranoid parenting and overprotection that upper class families do. So it has spread down from the top towards the bottom. Okay, now let's talk about the digital divide, because this is a really important feature of this current issue with phones. In the 90s and early 2000s, there was the digital divide. Because people were afraid. All the rich kids have computers and devices, and the poor kids don't. They're at a disadvantage. We have to give every kid a computer. In school, every kid must have the greatest distraction device ever invented in front of them on all the time, because that will equalize things. Guess what? It doesn't equalize things, because you know what the rich kids are doing? They're sending their kids to the Waldorf school where there's no technology. They're putting on all kinds of time limits. They're monitoring, they're watching, they're trying to get their kids off the screen. Whereas if you're a single mother with limited means, you can't hire a babysitter. You have just you don't have a second parent. So it's almost universal among the working class. I was just in the UK. 25% of their 5 to 7-year-olds have their own smartphone. 5 to 7. Because it just works. You give the kid a phone, and you can cook, you can do your email, you can do whatever. So where we are now is every fancy private school in the country is reading my book, and the parents are sending multiple copies to the headmaster, or you can't say it anymore, but the dean, the head of school. So that's great. It is starting among the elites. They're on it now. But let's start there. And going, phone-free schools, that is, I believe, going to drift down. I think we're going to change childhood. In a year or two, it's going to just feel different. Our expectations about what school is are going to be different. And so it's not exactly an answer to how do I think about class, but the class divide on the screen time and Gen Z issue is big, and we have to be wary of that. And so, and that's one more reason why phone-free schools are actually good for equity, that means equal outcomes, is that since the wealthier kids are not quite as addicted, they do have less time on their devices, going 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, every day is good for them. But for the kids who don't have that, the kids on the other side of the digital divide, they have too much digital, 6 or 7 hours a day without that will be really beneficial for them.
Yeah. Great. So I guess we'll open it up for the audience now. We'll have some microphones in the front. Please.
We have 20 minutes for questions, so that's Obviously, keep the usual things apply. Keep your question relatively short. Make sure that it's a question, et cetera, et cetera. But please, we welcome your questions. And especially, I mean, look, Musa and I talked about whether we should model disagreement, but we actually agree on almost everything, minor little things. So we didn't get much disagreement. But if there's anyone here who disagrees with anything we've said, I urge you to please ask a question.
In fact, we had some things that we thought were disagreements, and then we talked about them, and we were like, oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Jillian Meyer. I study moral psychology at Indiana University, Bloomington. I have a question about heterodoxy, just kind of in general. And before security throws me out of the conference, or I get canceled by the academy, just want to stress again, I love playing devil's advocate and seeing the other side of issues. So there's a plethora of psychology research that suggests that a form of orthodoxy creates better cohesive communities. You have like social psychological research, in-group, out-group, your own moral psych stuff with the Loyalty Foundation, Schwader and the ethics of community, Sharif and his religion and pro-sociality studies. Is there a utility to having an orthodox community to create a better community that maybe is more pro-social or arguably more moral than maybe a heterodox community?
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so yes, I think it depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on what your goal is for the institution. So there are certain, in general, things like appealing to superordinate identities, common goals, shared values, things like this, can really help people bridge differences and divides and kind of pursue, but it's very important for knowledge production in particular to have people who disagree clash and to have these different kinds of, so I think the kinds of things we're doing in higher ed are specific circumstances where more diversity and clashing is important. But I think it's actually important, and one thing that's undervalued in institutions of higher learning probably, in part because it makes us uncomfortable on the left to really focus on this. I think there's actually not as much emphasis as there should be on affirming refining people's affirmative capacities, on highlighting what's good about the prevailing order, what's working in our institutions, what's worth saving about the academy, about America, et cetera. I don't think there's a lot of focus on that in a way that's deleterious to the thing we're trying to do. But I do think in this particular context, for what we're trying to do here, it's very important to have clashing perspectives and to have an environment where people who dissent from the common, from the prevailing view have space to do that and to actually get a fair hearing and decent engagement.
Right. Yes, I would just add on, right, it all depends, thinking is for doing, what are we trying to do? If you're running a military unit, yeah, you probably want extraordinary cohesion and you want to take advantage of the human mind's ability to make things sacred. And in the military, there's a lot of sacredness in the flag, and you want to bind people together. So if what you need is incredible cohesion and teamwork, yeah, then diversity actually could be disruptive. You want to downplay all of that. But as Musa said, if the goal is knowledge production, well, John Stuart Mill, he who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. It's not going to work if you have orthodoxy. And that's why we chose the name Heterodox Academy. And that was literally Nick Rosenkranz's idea. When I said, well, it's a little obscure word, are people going to understand it? And we just say, we don't care, because it's a faculty initiative, it's an academic thing, so Heterodox Academy. Let's see, I had one other thought for you, but it's now flown my mind. Anyway, the point is, functionally speaking, oh yes, one other, which is, in a liberal, so how do people live together when they have different beliefs and values? One way is to just expel the people of different beliefs and values. Let's just have it be us. And that's a way that humans have chosen to live from time immemorial. But something happened in more recent times. We developed these liberal democracies. And this is my North Star, that a liberal democracy is the only way or the best way yet known for people to live together peacefully despite differences in religion, morality, other sorts of things. And so that's why there's so much really interesting thinking and writing these days. I think people like Yasha Monk and the whole persuasion area and Francis Fukuyama, liberalism doesn't mean left. And that's part of what unites us here, is not that we're on the right or on the left. It's that I think we generally have a liberal sentiment, and we're seeing the extraordinary illiberalism on the far left and the far right, and we're all like, wait, where are the sane people who want to live together and actually benefit from diversity, including viewpoint diversity? So that's all I would add on. Thanks.
Hello. Hi, John Kay from Quillette. I just, as I told Professor al-Gharbi before, the book is fantastic. I believe it's coming out in October.
Yep, October 8th.
I was lucky enough to get a review copy, and for anyone who hasn't looked at it, it's fantastic. But I wanted to ask you about some of the editorial decisions you made in the book. Your personal backstory is incredible, and it's amazing that most of it I just learned right now. You actually dispense with your personal backstory in a few paragraphs.
Yada yada.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, most people don't yada yada that kind of incredible backstory. I mean, John kind of said a boring backstory until he dropped acid.
Except for the LSD part.
Yeah, things kind of got interesting then. But no, but I mean, John is self-aware that it was kind of like, you know, Jewish, Yale, blah blah blah. But I'm wondering. So your book, it's Princeton University Press, and I'm wondering about your decision to publish an academic book with a university press instead of, you know, maybe a mainline press where an editor would have said, hey, wow, you have this incredible story. Let's put that front and center.
Yeah.
Instead, you start with French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and I was like, which is interesting, but you know, it's not exactly going to get you like on Oprah or whatever. So I'm wondering. I mean, John talked about this book on morality and capitalism that he hasn't written in 10 years. I'm wondering about your thinking about getting these great ideas out there, the decision to go with the university press and not focus on yourself, because you're like very self-abnegating in your editorial style.
Yeah. Well, so I think so. Part of the reason to go with the university press was mercenary. To be honest, I'm on the tenure track. Books that are published with popular presses don't really count for the purposes of even if I had published a New York Times best-selling book with Penguin, it wouldn't really matter for my tenure. Not really, in most fields. And there's a lot to say about that, but whatever. It's the field I have to play on. So that's part of it. As far as why not focusing, I mean, why I didn't focus too much on myself, I think one of the tensions is that the story is a big book. It's a big book in terms of, you know, this historical arc that goes goes like a century, and it's and so. For length purposes, for clarity purposes, for flow purposes, we were just really aggressive about cutting out anything that could be cut out, because we wanted to keep it as brief as possible. We wanted to keep it as affordable as possible. We wanted to keep it as focused as possible. And so that's why, you know, I guess my life story is interesting, but yeah, like what I was more interested in is these changes that have happened in the global economy and the ways that contemporary elites have been leveraging social justice discourse to justify inequalities. So we deserve our power, we deserve our influence and our authority because we think the right things. And you people who are the losers in the knowledge economy deserve to be ignored, deserve to be deplatformed, deserve to be not taken seriously because you hold the wrong views on race and gender and sexuality, racist, sexist, authoritarians, ignorant, etc. And so I think it's fascinating, both the growing inequality and the role that knowledge economy producers play in it. And more importantly, the way that we actually leverage social justice discourse. Ironically, egalitarian discourse is used to justify inequalities. And so exploring those tensions, I just tried to keep the focus as laser focused on that as I could.
Hi, I have a question. I'm Leslie Beenan, formerly at Portland State University. My question is about the category of unprotected people you mentioned earlier. And you said adjuncts, and I want to add to that what we called at Portland State non-tenure teaching track, which is a huge bolus of people, and then also medical school faculty who never have tenure. Do you have concrete suggestions for how to protect those people better? And also I'm curious whether you consider getting rid of tenure a mechanism that might help with that question.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, so that's a big, like one of the core tensions in higher ed today is that, and this is one of the big, I wrote a book on this, I wrote an article on this for the Chronicle called Universities Run on Disposable Scholars. And I flagged that one of the core tensions is that despite the fact that academia is a very left place, a very social justice oriented place, the fact is that a lot of the tenure line professors, the ways that we're able to enjoy the productivity that we have, the kind of autonomy we have, teaching the classes that we're interested in, the graduate courses on niche things that speak to our things instead of focusing on the big undergrad kind of common classes, the ways that we can free ourselves up to do research is by relying on this kind of pool of overproduced elites who are undercompensated, who have weak benefits, very little governance, authority, very little, yeah. And so as far as what to do about it, I think that's a big question. I think there are things that departments can do to give contingent faculty of all flavors, not just adjunct, kind of more governance authority in some of these decisions that are made. And I think that departments and institutions and faculty members who are tenure line can be more aggressive in trying to lobby for better pay, for longer contracts, more assured kind of employment conditions for people who are non-tenured. And so there are other things I think that tenured faculty can leverage some of their institutional capital to try to advocate for their contingent counterparts more effectively. I think that's probably the most likely mechanism that some of these positive, because the incentive structures that a lot of institutions are operating in right now push them to rely increasingly heavily on contingent faculty members. But the thing about it is tenure-line people shouldn't think themselves as being immune to these pressures themselves. Our own governance authority has been consistently eroded. A lot of the tenure-line positions, when someone steps down or retired, they're getting replaced by a bunch of contingent positions. The tenure-line lines are going away. So it's even in our interest, in our own, even if we're just being selfish, it's in our interest to think more carefully and operate in a more solidaristic way with faculty members who are not tenure line. Did that answer it well?
Yeah, I would just add, just very briefly, I would just add that if tenure was supposed to protect scholars and give them the security to say bold things, to question the received wisdom, well, it really hasn't been working very well in the last 10 or 15 years. And so, in part because we're afraid to say things, not because we're afraid of losing our jobs, although that actually is a possibility for tenured faculty now, but we're afraid because of social shaming within the academy. And that's what I've been trying to write about. Like, why did everything go insane in the 2010s? And I keep coming back to the change in the technological environment. Social media made it very easy for anyone to intimidate, shame, attack anyone. And this really changed the dynamics of the academy in such a way that tenure is not making people be bold and question the received wisdom. So I think we really should be rethinking this in this new era. Well,
and I think even when people aren't afraid of being canceled per se, they also don't want to be the person where they walk into the room and everyone's like, oh God, Tom's here. Sorry if there's anyone named Tom. Or they don't want to, walk into a hostile classroom, even if they're not worried about being canceled. They don't want to have an adversarial, situation where students are avoiding their class or students come into the class ready to, And so I think some of these social dynamics. So John McWhorter has talked about this briefly, how before he was out as a heterodox person, he used to get invited to a lot of events on campus and the enrollments in his, and then as he started being more out, he stopped getting invited to things, and that sucks. I mean, these are colleagues that you're around, that you plan on staying around indefinitely, and if they start avoiding you and shunning you, even if they're not canceling you per se, it sucks. It's very, and so people, and sometimes to avoid those kind of social sanctions, separate, distinct from the professional concerns and the concerns about being canceled or even publicly humiliated, just the idea of being ostracized. Seems to be a big driver.
John, Musa, thank you for years worth of illuminating writing and an hour's worth of illuminating conversation. My name is Ibu Patel. I run an organization called Interfaith America here in Chicago. So I'm going to ask the question directly and then do a little context. So my question is, how much of the narrow kind of intellectual culture of a certain set of elite universities, especially right now, has to do with the takeover of the scholarly mode of theory over the scholarly mode of empiricism?
Wait, say it again.
The scholarly mode that we could think of as theory
okay.
versus empiricism. Mm-hmm. Musa is nodding his head at a very geeky question. You can tell what he likes. Mm-hmm. So here's the context, right? So when I go to graduate school, it's very empirically focused. And I'm taught you need to make sure your sample is representative. You need to make sure your categories are accurate. You need to be very judicious about making even preliminary conclusions. And when you do, you apply Karl Popper, which is to say you seek the disconfirming fact. And my graduate advisor said to me, the cardinal sin of the social researcher is squeezing the world into his worldview. That's the cardinal sin. You study the world to create a worldview or a theory, a mid-level theory, a la Peter Berger, that has to be as accurate as possible to the world. And when you actually come to it, you challenge it. And I had friends on the other side of the university who were doing things that they called theory, which is basically everything can be explained by patriarchy, or everything can be explained by structural racism, and you only find the facts that fit the theory. Yeah. And then you wake up one day and you're like, well, wait a second, how do you explain that 57% of higher education is women and 42% is men if everything can be explained by patriarchy, which is one of the reasons that, in my background, scholars preferred empiricism over, again, the mode of theory.
There's definitely something there. Yeah.
Right, so I'm curious, is that part of what's happened?
Yeah, so it certainly is correlated. Many have pointed out that the problems in the university are not found in most departments of the university. It's concentrated in a few areas, and it tends to be areas that are more about theory and not empirical. The STEM fields tend not to have the problem. Now, although it's coming in through a variety of administrative and other means. But in physics, as I understand it, it's divided between theory and the empiricists. And I don't think the theoretical physicists like Oppenheimer, I don't think they're particularly going woke and burning things down now. So it's not necessarily theory. I think that's correlated with a lot of other things. I think it is actually. Let's do the sociology of the academy about why is this concentrated in a small number of departments, and then why most of the professors are true liberals in the sense that they believe in free speech. They're not trying to indoctrinate their students. A lot of studies show this. Why is it that they were so afraid? So Musa, what would you say about why has this been concentrated in a few disciplines?
Well,
in its origin.
Yeah. Well. So one thing I'll say also is I think in many cases the problem isn't even the theories themselves. It's that scholars fail to be reflexive about them. That is, they decline to apply these same theories and frameworks to people like themselves and the institutions that they sympathize with and the movements that they're a part of. And so this is one thing that I try to do in the book, actually, as I show that there's actually a lot of analytic power by taking some of these if you want to call it woke frameworks, and just applying them to us in a kind of symmetrical way. And that's often not what we do. And I'll say another problem, just to briefly nod to the first question, is that I think you're right. Oftentimes scholars, in my experience, very few scholars are really engaging in scholarship for the purpose of scoring political points or trying to indoctrinate anyone or anything like that. I think most scholars are committed to doing good work. There is a problem, though, that because we're this kind of narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society that comprises the professoriate, we have these kind of starting assumptions that never really get challenged and that lead us into funky areas. So an example that I talk about a lot is when we want to study something like polarization, because all of us are on the blue line, our starting question isn't what's going on with like if we notice that the distance between us and other people is growing, we don't start by going, well, what is so weird about us? Why are we changing? What's going on with us? We just assume that if we're growing further apart, it must be because of the red line people.
Right. What's the matter with Kansas?
Yes, and if we're trying to explain something that's negative, that we think of as negative, our starting assumptions are to explain it in terms of deficits and pathology. This is just so if we want to understand why someone votes for Trump, and we think voting for Trump is bad, then our starting assumption, the way people conduct studies then, is which negative trait best explains why someone would vote for Trump. Is it that they're more racist or sexist or authoritarian?
His children, that's why.
Yeah,
right?
And if someone did a study like, why would someone vote for Hillary Clinton? Is it that they're communists or they're atheists or they hate America? We would immediately recognize the issue. And so this kind of biased study design doesn't come about necessarily because the people who are conducting the studies are trying to score points for Hillary Clinton or as part of resistance activity. There's a little bit of that, but more commonly, it's that they literally have a tough time imagining how anything other than some negative trait could explain why those people kind of behave the way they do. They just don't understand their behavior.
It's almost as if you need someone who has different starting assumptions and different confirmation biases to help you find the truth. So I realize that. Okay. So it's now 11:12, and I think the concurrent sessions, are they supposed to start like right away? Is there a break in between? At any rate, as David Brooks says, we have a rising intellectual star here. I hope you all pay a lot of attention, read his work, and enjoy the conference. This is a lot of fun. Musa, always fun to talk
Join me
with
in
you.
thanking our panelists. Thank you so much.